Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to tell you what my favourite classics of 2019 were. And of course, I mean my favourite classics that I've read in 2019, not classics that were published in 2019, because that wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. But I'm sure this clarification was entirely unnecessary. Just to recap, I consider a classic any book that was written before 1960. You can argue with me about that definition. Actually, don't argue with me about that definition. It's my own personal definition of a classic. And today I've just picked out, I think it's 7 books that I'm going to talk about today that I read in 2019 that have really impressed me. So these are all books that I've given 4 or 5 star ratings to on Goodreads, and just books that I've really enjoyed. And I am going to warn you, there is a shocking amount of Ian Forster on this list. I really dived into his books this year, and generally speaking, there's a lot of early 20th century literature. Now, normally I read more 19th century classics or mid 20th century classics, but this year I've really enjoyed books from the first 3 decades of the 20th century. By the way, I expect that this is going to be a rather long video, so if you want to jump to a specific classic that I'm discussing, check out the description box. There are going to be timestamps so you can click on the books that you're interested in, and that will take you to the point in the video where I talk about those specific books. Let's start with the first classic that I really enjoyed in 2019, and that was Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Now, I did a separate review video of this, which I'm going to link in the description box as well, so I'll keep this quite short. I read this in January as part of my 4 Centuries novel project, in which I read 4 books from 4 centuries. And Robinson Crusoe was the first one chronologically. It was published in 1719, can you believe it? 300 years ago. And I gave this one 4 stars. I was so impressed with the readability of this book. I really expected to have to fight my way through it. I really expected to struggle with the language, with the narration, and with the plot itself. But actually, it is quite readable for a modern audience, and maybe that's because I listened to the audiobook, and that makes the really endless sentences a little bit more digestible. Robinson Crusoe, as I'm sure you all know, is the story of a man who's out voyaging when his ship sinks, and he ends up on a remote, lonely island where he is the only inhabitant, and he has to fight for his life. He has to survive on this island, and he manages to survive for quite a few decades. I like survival stories because I know that if I was out in the wild, I would probably die within the first week, and therefore it kind of gives me a little bit of a thrill to read about people who are more adept at actually surviving, at producing their own food, producing their own shelter, living within the wilderness that is the natural world. The book is written as a diary, so it's in first-person narration, and I think that really kind of makes you identify a little bit with this random man stranded on an island. Now, there are a lot of problematic issues, as you would expect from a book published 300 years ago. The most prevalent is the way that he treats essentially his slave, a boy named Friday, whom he basically kidnaps. And I talk about this a little bit more in my full-length review of that, so again, I would urge you to go and watch that if you're interested. And yes, for the 21st century reader, that does impact your experience of the book. So I just wanted to put that out there. Overall, though, I really enjoyed my experience of reading this. I just didn't expect to actually enjoy a book that's that old, which is really silly because of course I love my classics, and yet somehow I didn't expect that I could connect to a narrative that is 300 years old. That's incredible. So if you've been curious about Robinson Crusoe, but you've been kind of a little bit afraid of reading it for the same reasons that I was, I recommend you give it a go. I would highly recommend that you listen to the audiobook narrated by Simon Vance. I found that made it so much easier for me to understand and follow along with the story. The second classic I want to talk about today, and this is one that I read in February, was Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden. This was published in 1910. Actually, it was either published in 1910 or in 1916. I genuinely cannot read my handwriting here. Look it up yourselves. And this is a children's classic that follows a really grumpy girl who ends up orphaned and ends up moving into the house of an equally grumpy man in the dark and misty Yorkshire countryside. The story is so magical. I'd previously read Frances Hodgson Burnett's boarding school novel A Little Princess, and I loved it. And I was a little bit worried that The Secret Garden wouldn't quite be at the same level, but it is. It combines some really beautiful imagery. Obviously, there is the gardening aspect, there's nature coming to life, there is the use of nature as a metaphor for human transformation, for changing your outlook, for changing your mind. It's such an inspirational story, and I don't use that word lightly. Very few things inspire me. I could really identify with so many of the characters in this book, and in a way it reminded me a lot of Johanna Spyri's Heidi. So if you are familiar with Heidi, and you want a book that has the same kind of magic, that has the same love for nature and love for the outside and love for the transformative nature of wildlife, then I would really recommend that you read A Secret Garden. I enjoyed the characters so much, both the children and the adult characters. What I really love about Burnett's writing is that she doesn't make her adults all villains, but in fact that every single character in this book has their own place, has their own motivations, has their own part to play in the story. It's a really lovely, positive book. It's something that you should read maybe just at the darkest point of this winter. Maybe if you haven't picked it up yet, read it in early February. Experience a little bit of that heartwarming magic that just flows through every page of this book. And Burnett's writing is just beautiful. Her language is absolutely gorgeous, and I think it is that which is going to make a reread of this so enjoyable. So again, I slightly prefer A Little Princess just because I love the setting and I love the main character in that just a little bit more, but The Secret Garden is still a really wonderful tale, and I gave it 4 stars. The third classic I want to read is the first Ian Forster of this video, and I'm going to talk about The Longest Journey by Ian Forster. This was published in 1907, and it follows a student slash graduate of Cambridge University. He is just about to finish his studies, and he's kind of drifting in life. He doesn't really know what to do next, and he is kind of bouncing between his family, his friends, his romantic interest, and nothing really quite satisfies him. Now, out of all the Ian Forster novels I've read so far, this is the most kind of realistic one. This is the one with the least flowery language, with the least romantic magic in it, with the least positivity as well. I thought it was quite a dark novel, really. It deals with issues like loveless marriages, alcoholism, abuse. It's got some really dreary realism about it that a lot of other Ian Forster novels don't have. And yet, like all other Ian Forster novels, it's beautiful to read. The language, the prose is just gorgeous. This one surprised me a little bit. The main character is, I think, a person that a lot of us can feel for, even though I and most of you probably aren't middle-class graduates of Cambridge University. But we've definitely all been at this point in our lives where we have to make a decision and we're not sure about where to go, where we maybe have to take a path that we're not entirely happy about, where we maybe have to take a job that we're not entirely happy about, and where we just can't stop dreaming about this one creative goal in life, even though realistically we know we're not going to get there. Because the main character in this, Ricky, he really wants to be a writer. He has this ambition to become an author, and yet while he writes stories, he doesn't really show them to anyone. He's not really very confident in his own work, and so he ends up a teacher. And I mean, how many teachers in this country, how many teachers in this world are people who have been there, who know exactly what he's going through? So I would really recommend The Longest Journey if you are already a fan of Ian Forster. I probably wouldn't pick it as a first Ian Forster to read, but as an established Ian Forster fan, I really loved it as well. I gave it 4 stars. And yeah, it's just a little bit different from his other novels, but not in a bad way. Next up, let's talk about one of the really hard-hitting books I read this year. Truly mind-blowing, and that is 1984 by George Orwell. This mid-century dystopian novel was published in 1949, and if I look at the history of dystopian fiction, I think the late 1940s, early 1950s were really a time where a lot of high-quality dystopia and post-apocalyptic novels were written, and it's not hard to see why. Obviously, George Orwell wrote this during and just after the Second World War, an event that must have impacted the lives of everyone alive at that time quite severely in a way that we probably can't even imagine. But what came out of this is a true masterpiece. And I hate myself for saying that, because it sounds like such a cliche to go, oh yes, 1984 is a masterpiece of literature. But it really, really is. I wish that I had read this book in print, because I listened to it on audiobook. I bought a print version after that, after I'd read it, but I know that if I'd read this book in print, I would have wanted to underline like half of the novel. In 1984, we follow a middle-aged man named Winston Smith who works for his government. Now, his government is a totalitarian system controlling everyone's lives in England. And Winston Smith works actively to change history for his country. So he is one of the many employees that are actively changing what the populace knows about their own history. That is a really terrifying thought, because in 2019 we've seen plenty of people trying to erase history, trying to change history, trying to cover up the lessons we're supposed to be learning from history. And I think that's why 1984 is so hard-hitting now in the 21st century. The story itself is partly about rebellion, it's partly about truth, it's about uncovering the truth, it's about it touches on so many different things, on sexual freedom, segregation of different classes. It touches on gender issues. It touches obviously on different political systems, on the way that technology can impact our lives. And I really think that all of these are very important lessons for us to learn. Oh wow, I'm making this sound really fun. Yes, the plot is also quite gripping. It's very harrowing to read. Definitely don't read this if you're in a fragile state of mind. It's brutal, it's cruel, it's torturous, but it is just so impactful. I'm always slightly struck when people create this dichotomy between 1984 and Aldous Huxley's work, Brave New World. I have read both, and I don't think that Brave New World comes anywhere near the true horror of the dystopian world of 1984, but that is just my opinion. I'm sure if you enjoyed one, you'll also enjoy the other. And if you haven't read 1984 yet, and we are just going into 2020, it's about time. This was, I believe, my first 5-star rating of the year, or at least my first 5-star rated classic of the year. I read this one in April and it still sticks with me. And honestly, I'm gonna have to do a reread of this quite soon. Let's move on to the next novel, and hey, we're back to Ian Forster. So next I read Where Angels Fear to Tread. I read this one in June while I was on holiday, actually. I mean, I say on holiday, Bill and I kind of drove about half an hour into the Welsh countryside and rented a little cottage there for a few days. So I read this while away, and it's the perfect holiday book because Where Angels Fear to Tread is partly set in Italy. Now, this was published in 1905, and the main character is a young widow who leaves her young daughter and her in-laws, who kind of control her life, behind. and goes on a little road trip to Italy. So she goes on Italy on holiday, and then all of a sudden her family back home in England receive the message that she has married an Italian man 10 years her junior and is pregnant. What a setup, right? I mean, this, if it sounds like the plot of a rom-com, it kind of is, except because it's Ian Forster, there's so many layers on top of that. I found this his most hilarious novel, and I think partly that is because my family are Italian, so a lot of the things that he's basically taking the piss off are things that I can kind of point to an aunt or an uncle or a cousin and say, yeah, they're exactly like that. I love when Ian Forster does these culture clash narratives, because what he manages to do perfectly in Where Angels Fear to Tread is that he is equally taking the piss out of the Italians and the English. So he is very gently but subtly, humorously poking fun at English traditions that Italians think are absolutely ridiculous, Italian traditions that English think are absolutely ridiculous, the way that people talk to each other, the way that people connect to each other. I loved it. It's not a 100% comedy novel. Like in a lot of Ian Forster, there's a lot of pathos, there's a lot of deep emotions, big emotions, love and hate and heartbreak and all of those things in there, which is quite surprising because it is a rather short novel. It's not going to take you more than a couple of days to read through it. It's very short, it's very punchy. If you like a good holiday novel, pick up Where Angels Fear to Tread by Ian Forster. Staying in the early 20th century, my next book and my second 5-star read of the year was Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And this is another novel that I have made a separate video about. It's a little bit weird, it's not quite a review, but I'll link it down below anyway. And in that video I reflect about some of the messages and some of the arguments and some of the ideas in A Room of One's Own while reflecting on my own room of my own, which is this space here. Now, what's actually really interesting is that for a few weeks this year, for about 2 months, I gave up this room. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this. If you have, you've been very polite and you've not been asking me about this, which I kind of appreciate. But for a while, my videos were not filmed in this space, but in various other spaces around the house. And that was because I actually had a friend live here in this very room for about 2 months when she had to very urgently and at short notice move out of the place that she'd been living in before. We offered her this space, and there's a little guest bed in the corner, and she lived here for some weeks. While I'm glad that I could do this for her, it was a very weird sensation to have to give up this space. And that really made me appreciate what an incredible luxury it is to have a space of my own. And I know that a lot of people, and especially a lot of women, don't have that privilege. So it was very interesting to go through that just after reading A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, because while her book, and it's an essay really, was published in 1929, so 90 years ago, there are still a lot of ideas in that that are super, super relevant to our times. Now, when we look at feminism throughout history, a lot of what was written even just 10 years ago feels horribly outdated and just not very relevant today. But Virginia Woolf really manages to get straight to the core of the issue of why women find it so hard to do certain things, including accumulating wealth, publishing literature, making a place for themselves in the world, passing on knowledge. It's a very short essay, and she really packs a punch in there. She talks about some things that are super relevant today, as well as I keep calling it novel, as well as the essay being incredibly relevant, incredibly thoughtful, very thought-provoking. It's also very well written. The style is gorgeous. It's got a subtle humor about it that's clearly covering up a lot of anger. I admire that about Virginia Woolf, how she manages to stay gentle and humorous and witty in the face of so much discrimination and unfairness. So really highly recommend A Room of One's Own. It's only the second non-fiction book that I've ever given 5 stars to. I don't normally like non-fiction, but I certainly found a lot to like about A Room of One's Own. Okay, we're almost done now. 2 more novels to go. The next one is one that I read during Victober this year, and it's called Gloriana, or The Revolution of 1900, and it's by a relatively unknown author named Lady Florence Caroline Dixie. This was published in 1890, and this is another book that I've done a separate video about, so I will link that in the description box as well. And I recommend you watch that because that is a proper book review video. What intrigued me about this book, why I picked this up, is that it's described as a feminist utopia published in the Victorian era. Just not the sort of novel that I would expect from my 1890 release, and yet it's exactly what it says on the tin. This novel explores an alternate future in which women get to power. And the way that they get to power is through the main heroine of the book, a girl named Gloriana, who at age 12 decides that she wants to go to Eton, famously a boys' boarding school. So she, with the help of her mother, manages to smuggle her way into Eton, and from then on presents as a boy and then later as a man who gets himself elected into the House of Commons and eventually shapes policy. What I like about this book is that while it is about a kind of individual feat, about, you know, a heroine really being a trailblazer, this book is also about collective feminist power and collective feminist action, because Gloriana has a lot of help from her friends, both female and male, and with that help she manages to craft the future of her country just the way that she likes. And by pulling up women, she also pulls up the working classes. It's kind of a pre-intersectional feminist narrative. She fights for a lot of different causes that all work together to make the life of everyone better. It's a really fun story. It's definitely not the most masterfully written novel. It takes a lot of ideas from popular adventure fiction of the time. It's got a lot of sensationalism, a lot of sentimentality, and other words beginning with S, sexiness, maybe. It's got a lot of those things in it, but actually that's what I loved so much about it. It combines kind of cheap narrative devices with serious political points, and it's just such a weird and attractive mix that I'm so glad I picked this up in Victober. And so we get to the final classic that I want to talk about today, and that is another Virginia Woolf. I told you, I'm just stuck in the early 20th century this year. The last book I want to talk about is Night and Day by Virginia Woolf. And again, I did a separate review video for that book. Link in the description box. Check that out to hear my kind of more, what's the word in English? To hear my more extensive and detailed thoughts. This was published in 1919, and in a way it's the perfect way to end my classics reading of the year, because I started it with a book from 1719 and ended it with a book from 1919, and Night and Day is a very different novel to Robinson Crusoe. In it we follow 4 main characters, 2 women, 2 men, all living in London, all going about their lives, all kind of middle class, but all coming from different kind of parts of the middle class. Oh dear, my camera is flashing. Oh no, this has never happened before. Right, I'm going to be quick. It explores human relationships in a really beautiful way. It's got big feelings, big romance, big heartbreak. It is a very romantic novel. I would describe it as a romance, even though a lot of other things happen in the book as well. 4 people, so you can imagine that the relationships aren't as straightforward as you'd think. Touches on issues of feminism, of women's rights, of class divisions, of purpose. What's your purpose in life? Really, some very big questions asked. Some of them answered, some of them not. Oh, I'm getting really panicky now because my camera is failing. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. Watch my Night and Day review video for more detailed thoughts. I had a really great year in classics. I really loved the books that I read, and I hope that you had the same kind of experience. Tell me about your favourite classics down below. Let me know if you've read any of the ones I've mentioned, or if you want to read them now I've mentioned them. The next video coming up will be my favourite contemporary novels of the year, so if you're not a classics person then you can look out for that. And finally, before my camera fails, I just want to mention I have a Patreon now. Check the link in the description box to check that out as well. Thank you for watching. Bye!